Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, about the killer from Dead by Daylight's second ever licensed chapter, Freddy Krueger, otherwise known as the Nightmare. If any character I've ever made a video on has earned the honour of needing no introduction, it's Frederick Charles Krueger. No one will stop me doing one though. Ever since his cinematic debut in Nightmare of Elm Street in 1984, Freddy has been an icon of slasher horror, arguably its single greatest icon ever made. He's not as old as Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees or Leatherface, but Freddy's permeated popular culture in a way that his predecessors never did. Except maybe Jason, but that's up for debate. I never loved the franchise as much as I did Halloween or Saw, but there's no denying how much impact Nightmare on Elm Street and Freddy Krueger had on the horror genre. Wes Craven defined the 80s to early 90s slasher craze when he made Nightmare on Elm Street. Before Freddy, we mostly had invincible, largely non-verbal slashers like Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees and even the Terminator. But after him, we got to see a lot of personality and dialogue in our slashers. Candyman, Chucky, Mick Taylor. Hell, the entire film career of Rob Zombie wouldn't have been possible without Freddy to blaze the trail. Freddy Krueger revitalised the struggling slasher genre and was a key player until its dying days in the early 90s, before Wes Craven managed to make lightning strike twice and revitalised the slasher genre again with Scream. Upon its release, the 2010 remake of the original Nightmare on Elm Street was not received terribly well. Despite being the second highest grossing film in the franchise, behind Freddy vs. Jason, critics and audiences didn't care for it, and a substantial amount of backstage drama effectively killed any franchise potential the film could have spawned. With the rights to Freddy having recently been reverted back to the Craven estate, there's been rumours of a second remake in the works, but that's all that's left of this former giant of horror, rumours that all might not be lost. So when Freddy Krueger was revealed to be coming to Dead by Daylight, a lot of Nightmare fans were probably less than overjoyed when they learned that the Freddy they were getting wasn't the original Englund iteration, but instead the Jackie L. Haley Freddy from the remake. Their concerns were understandable. That movie had all but killed Nightmare on Elm Street as a bankable franchise, and Robert Englund was such an iconic part of Freddy's identity that many people felt cheated, like they were getting a bootleg knockoff Freddy rather than the real deal. Look, I'm not exactly a superstitious guy, but in hindsight, this was probably a sign that this chapter was not going to be smooth sailing. Freddy launched in a catastrophic ball of fire on October the 26th, 2017, along with everyone's favourite goblin Quentin Smith as his survivor, and his old haunt Badham Preschool as a map. While many were quick to welcome this inclusion of the giant of horror history, Freddy's actual power was not received well, to say the least. It was unintuitive, weird, and on the surface of it, very weak against good survivors, while also being very strong against bad survivors, which led to his kit being absolutely gutted for the sake of those bad survivors. I don't know where it sounds familiar, but it really does. After being widely considered the worst killer in the game after the train of nerfs arrived, Freddy eventually received a rework in patch 3.1.0 on July the 24th, 2019, to decide to make him stronger. And regardless of the state of post-rework Freddy, it certainly succeeded at that. But I'm gonna make a suggestion here. The Freddy rework that saw him soar from the bottom of the competitive barrel to the highest kill rate in Dead by Daylight came at the cost of his artistic merit. In effect, it scooped out his soul. To find out whether this is true or not, we have to look at the original source material. We need to distill who and what Freddy is, what makes the character tick, and then look at the implementation to Dead by Daylight to see how well the two line up. So let's get started with what makes Freddy Freddy. Ever since his debut in 1984, he's been consistently presented with a few key traits that have made him a memorable icon of horror for almost 40 years. Freddy rarely, if ever, has a real physical form, instead appearing in the nightmares of his victims to torment them in the dream world, where his power was effectively unlimited, so long as his victims feared him too much to attempt to seize control, and didn't wake up. After filling his victims' nightmares to the point that they could barely remain conscious, Freddy would go on to kill them in their sleep in a variety of brutal ways, and as they died in the dream, they would die in real life as well. Freddy's powers in the dream world were mostly defined by how much his victims feared him. Like a nightmare, his only potency came from people believing him to be real and threatening. But reducing him to just a nightmare that kills people does the character a serious injustice. Until he hung up the fedora and claw glove after Wes Craven's New Nightmare in 1994, Robert Englund brought Freddy to life by actually interacting with his victims. In that way, he maintained a lot of the predatory idiosyncrasies typical of real-life serial killers. They're not emotionless butchers, but instead sickly, twisted people, who often go after those they know or perceive to be vulnerable, so they can revel in their power over them. In the original continuity, Freddy was a megalomaniacal killer of children, who was burned to death by the parents of Springwood after a legal technicality resulted in him walking free after murdering several of their young children. Death wouldn't accept him, so he returned to gleefully torment the surviving kids in their nightmares, mostly killing them when they were teenagers. That's how a lot of people remember him from the original run of movies, but his backstory and personality was substantially changed for the 2010 remake. Instead of being a child murderer, Freddy Krueger was a paedophile, burned to death by the parents of Springwood for abusing their children because they didn't want to see the children forced to recount what he did to them.
You are a paedophile. You are a nonce. You are a perv. You're a slot badger. You're a two-pin din plug. You're a bush dodger. You're a small beam regarder. You're an Unabummer. You're a nut administrator. You're a bent ref. You're the crazy world of Arthur Brown. You're a fence foal. You're a free willy. You're a chimney bottler. You're a bunty man. You're a shrub rocketeer.
Most of the thematic and personality differences between the classic Freddy many people have grown used to, and the remake that we have in Dead by Daylight, can be summed up by Freddy being a child molester in the remake, rather than simply a child killer. The atmosphere of both Haley's Freddy and the movie as a whole is much more grim than the atmosphere of the original movies, especially the sequels, because the nature of Freddy's power dynamic over his victims is quite different. In the originals, Freddy is a slasher reborn to finish the job, and so he has the same compelling nature as other slashers like Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees, where we're largely just here to watch him kill oblivious and often sexually promiscuous teenagers. That lack of awareness, combined with Robert Englund's inherent charisma, made the audience side with Freddy in a way. The teenagers he killed were ignorant of the things the audience was aware of, and so in many ways deserved their deaths at Freddy's hands for that ignorance. But the child molester Freddy that we see in the remake doesn't have that charisma, because his teenage prey aren't just mindless victims, they're survivors of sexual abuse. They've already suffered at Freddy's hands. We can't just detach from them and watch Freddy cut them to pieces because we're supposed to care about them. Freddy was never a sympathetic character, but he's much more of a monster in the remake, because sexually abusing children is on a whole other level of evil, and his relationship with his victims is a lot more personal. Robert Englund's Freddy was campy and almost self-aware in his charisma, winking at the camera and hamming it up to turn his killing spree into a spectacle. The reason you went to see the movie. Jackie L. Haley's Freddy is taken much more seriously, because trying to get an audience to root for a sadistic child molester is pretty much impossible. I've heard people say that they wanted Dead by Daylight's Freddy to have more of the Englund era charisma. Maybe some voice lines like Ash has, or a bit more dramatic flair in his Mori animation. But if you ask me, I think that would reduce what makes Haley's Freddy so effective. And before I go on, I don't want to be seen as the guy ragging on Englund's performance as Freddy. I mean, the man defined who Freddy Krueger is. The charisma he brought to the role made Krueger stand out from the other slashers of the 80s. Hell, the man had a TV show where he told horror stories. For all the people who really wanted Englund's Freddy in DVD, I understand. Nobody can really replace him. But I've got to give credit to Haley. His darker, more serious tone for Freddy suits Dead by Daylight's grim atmosphere perfectly. People always say they want their killers to be more unforgivable, with less tragedy in their stories. Haley's Freddy is as unforgivable as a character can be. The 2010 Freddy is predatory, merciless, insidious, and most importantly, unexpected. The remake explores concepts only alluded to in the original movies, most notably the concept of microsleep. A microsleep, referred to as a micronap in the movie, is a phenomenon first documented in 1989, when the human brain shuts off for short periods of time, about 30 seconds or so, to put you into a brief state of unconsciousness as a way to deal with sleep deprivation. This means that Freddy's presence escalates over the course of the movie, as his survivors become more and more sleep deprived and their microsleeps start increasing in frequency. England's Freddy maintained tension through the inevitability of sleep. The knowledge that at some point you'll have to go to sleep, and that's when he'll get you. But Haley's Freddy felt like a more constant threat, where the inevitability is made obvious by Freddy's increased intrusion into his victims' daily lives while still being limited to the dream world. That is the biggest success of Dead by Daylight's adaptation of Freddy out of the whole chapter. That threat of constant but obscured danger, the paranoia that your next sleep could be anywhere at any time, by the time you realise it, it's already too late. Freddy's original kit embraced that paranoia, that implacable shift between safety in the woken world and terror in the dream world, that you can't stop until you're already there. And when you're there, well, Freddy's coming for you. For those who don't know, old Freddy couldn't harm or be seen by the survivors until he manually pulled them into the dream world, by targeting them with a mid-range lock-on type beam, with a short transition time before Freddy could hit them. In effect, he permanently occupied the dream world, and could only hurt survivors who he had pulled in with him. Survivors in the dream world were subject to crippling penalties for their action speed too, and Freddy could discern the aura of any sleeping survivor outside his 16-metre terror radius, meaning there was nowhere to hide from him and there was a serious urgency to waking up, because the more people stayed asleep, the more Freddy could grind the game to a crippling halt. That sense of fatigue, of constantly having to stay on your toes and prioritise staying awake at any cost, was key to defining Freddy's character in the movie, and he got carried over to the game extremely well. His add-ons were designed with a similar dedication to the source material. Every single one of Freddy's add-ons came from a prop featured somewhere in the movie. And yes, I kept trying to double check this while I watched the film for this video. The lore segment Behaviour wrote to explain his arrival into the fog was very cleverly made, as an extension of the events of the movie, that explored something new and exciting about Freddy, how he acts as the trapped subject of a force even stronger than him. Even visually, Freddy looks very loyal to his remake depiction. I mean, sure, his model could do with a touch-up to get to the standards of today, but he has that desiccated look that fits with the appearance of real-life burn victims. At least on paper, the adaptation of Jackie L. Haley's Freddy into Dead by Daylight was a roaring success, if we ignore his actual balance state at the time. To give a bit of context, Freddy was implemented into the game in kind of a hack job. Behaviour was trying to get the rights to Freddy off New Line Cinema for a while, and they were very stubborn in retaining them, to the point that Behaviour had all but given up on getting them as the 2017 Halloween release. Instead, the rights holders for Leatherface actually approached Behaviour to try and get Bubba Sawyer into the game in Freddy's October release slot. Behaviour immediately started work on Leatherface as a hybrid original and licensed chapter, pairing Leatherface with a new map and an original survivor who would later go on to be Kate Denson. But at the last minute, New Line cracked and let Behaviour loose with Freddy's rights, and that put Behaviour in a bit of a pickle. They were working on two licenses at once that were competing for the October release window, so they decided to focus on the far profitable Nightmare on Elm Street franchise and relegated Bubba to a paragraph of his own, slotted in just before Freddy's launch in September. This resulted in what I would call DBD's roughest ever release period for both licenses. Leatherface and Freddy were both mimetically bad killers who eventually received reworks. Bad and Preschool was, and remains to this day, one of the worst designed maps ever made, and Freddy and Quentin's Perks both more or less universally sucked, although I must admit Bubba's are actually pretty solid. You want to talk about how underwhelming Binding of Kin and All Kill were on release? But they were nothing compared to how disastrous these two licensed collaborations were. In effect, both chapters were rather half-baked, and there's a reason Behaviour spaces out a lot of its licensed releases nowadays. Freddy was not widely considered to be Dead by Daylight's weakest killer for no reason. His kit lacked map pressure. A lot of people found the delay on putting targets to sleep to be a frustrating limitation to his power, and a lot of survivors didn't like how crippling staying asleep was, especially since you had to fail a skill check and lose progress on whatever it was you were doing to wake up. So behaviour promised a rework to him, making Freddy the first killer whose power was to be rebuilt from the ground up. I was barely playing the game when old Freddy was around, and the bad things I heard about him meant I put off buying his DLC for a very long time. So I sadly missed out on the old Freddy experience for the most part, although I do remember playing 1 or 2 games with him by using Smoking Splinter offerings back in the day. God, I kinda miss those. What I can talk about though is new Freddy. While old Freddy was a weird kinda stealth killer, so stealthy that he had to make you see him before he could hurt you, new Freddy is a lot more traditional, in line with the other killers. Instead of having to actively pull you into the dream world for you to be at his mercy, he just hits you. He's a threat to survivors even when they're awake, which on one hand kinda makes sense with the whole microsleep thing, but on the other hand strips away what makes Freddy Freddy. If the survivors are vulnerable to him all the time, even outside the dream world, what makes him different from Michael Myers or Leatherface? And while the rework made threatening survivors who weren't asleep significantly easier, it also made survivors waking themselves up easier and massively reduced the penalties for staying asleep. Now, instead of the fatigue setting in to slow down actions and reveal the survivors' locations to Freddy, they became vulnerable to his environmental hazards in the form of dream snares or fake pallets, which is kind of uninspired. Freddy is known for using the environment to his advantage in the dreams, but not really in that way. The snares at least have some sort of precedent in the blood hallway that Nancy finds herself in during the movie's climax. But when you think of Freddy, you don't think of traps. You think of that painful fatigue, that feeling of your energy draining away as your time runs out, and you know you'll have to go to sleep at some point, and when you do, God help you. But the alarm clocks completely deflate that tension, because all you've got to do is poodle off down the Tesco and wake up by yourself. Although I will admit there are a few elements of new Freddy that work very well thematically, most notably the teleport and the high rarity add-ons. Pill bottle, meaning that Freddy carrying someone is invisible to survivors, reminds me of the scene in the remake where he kills Chris by throwing her around the room in her sleep, which is itself a shout out to Tina's death in the original movie. And the Z-block inducing fake bleeding really plays into the fantasy of creating a macabre and twisted dream world that doesn't follow reality's laws. Meanwhile, the teleport is easily the smartest part of Freddy's rework, turning what should be a symbol of light and safety, the generator, into a potential threat that could send you running for your life is very on brand for Freddy. Kind of like that surge of blood that spills out of the bed when Freddy kills Glenn in the original movie. A symbol of home and security, twisted by Freddy into a bloody horror show. And it gives him that surprise potential and omnipresence that Freddy is known for. But just because the rework got some elements of Freddy right, doesn't mean it didn't get a lot more very wrong indeed. For every step forward, it took 2 steps back. It got the presence of Freddy right with the teleport, but lost a lot of what made him unique by diminishing the effectiveness and relevance of the dream world. It nailed the weirdness of the add-ons that reflect his bizarre power set, but dropped the ball with his dream snares that just feel like a stripped down version of Clown that doesn't feel true to who Freddy is. I've always said the greatest thing a killer in this game can be is unique, because a strong and unique concept is something that can be tweaked and adjusted into a more balanced state over time. Look at the Doctor, fundamentally a super solid and unique design who received a rework that mostly smoothed him out, making him feel better to play, but keeping the fundamental concept and fantasy of the Doctor the same. Other killers like this with good and unique core concepts that just need some fine tuning to really flourish in this game's current state include Michael Myers, the twins, and yes, old Freddy. Not to be too coarse, but behaviour took almost everything unique about old Freddy out behind the shed and shot it in an attempt to make the character competitively viable. They tried to sacrifice uniqueness for something safe, something strong, simple and intuitive for both sides, and in doing so, they effectively ruined what chances Freddy had to flourish in the game. especially because Freddy went from arguably the weakest killer in the game to one of the strongest, despite his new kit having arguably the lowest skill floor and ceiling in the game, necessitating a second mini rework further down the line. When it came to Freddy's new power design, Behaviour traded freedom for security and found themselves with neither, because they turned Freddy from a complex but inefficient killer, reflective of his distinctive traits and methods of killing, into just a regular 115 M1 killer, except with pretty uninteresting means to shortcut elements of the game like map traversal and chasing. It turned him from one of the most interesting but flawed killers they've ever made into one of the most bland. So when the developers spoke about upcoming adjustments, I was hoping we'd see some restoration of what made old Freddy feel so unique, with elements of new Freddy that maybe he'd need to compete in the modern game of Dead by Daylight. But what we got was just a weaker version of new Freddy. Fewer snares, fewer pallets, weaker add-ons. It felt like Behaviour's final betrayal of Freddy as a character, content to leave him be in a lukewarm hell of mediocrity, where his gameplay remains as generic as could be. I spoke so highly of Myers' design in my Halloween video because despite his problems functioning as a game element, he will always be evocative of the feeling of being Michael Myers. But Freddy's never really had the chance to bring people that same feeling. Old Freddy had the pieces, sure, but if anything was too loyal to his source material, to the point that he felt anemic and unable to keep pace with the game of cat and mouse that Dead by Daylight had become. And new Freddy's literally just clown with map ability for the most part. The dream world is more noticeable as a weird filter over the map terrain than it is an actual place of threat for you. In many ways, this video is a eulogy for Freddy Krueger. The 2010 movie kissed goodbye with Nightmare on Elm Street as a respected horror franchise, and Dead by Daylight has botched any attempt to resuscitate the magic of those movies in the game. They say Dead by Daylight has become the horror hall of fame for the iconic slashers of fiction, but the master of Springwood's nightmares has always struggled to fit in. With these new nerfs likely set to confine Freddy to mediocrity for the rest of his days, Behaviour's probably fine keeping him there after his time of dominance. So we're unlikely to get any changes to him that really reflect who Freddy was always meant to be. I'm not lamenting he'll be weak or anything. I'm disappointed that Behaviour had such a perfect opportunity to make the expression of Freddy as a character feel more complete, and deliver on the power fantasy that Freddy had always promised. But what we got was effectively the opposite. Regardless of whether he's strong or weak, Freddy's dead, and has been for some time now. All we can really do is remember him, and hopefully he'll come back to bring our nightmares to life once again. Who knows? Maybe this ignominious end of Freddy Krueger is all just a bad dream. Once again, thank you all so much for watching. For Quentin fans out there, don't worry, he's getting his own video at some point, but I just wanted to get this one on Freddy made before the deluge of new content starts, with For the Forsaken Tome coming next week. If you like my content, then please do leave a comment or even subscribe, that would mean a lot to me. And in the description you can find links to my Discord server, links to my Twitch stream, and if you really like me you can even find my Patreon and Ko-fi links down there as well, and my Twitter if you want to follow me for future updates. So, once again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Sweet dreams.